Hi, CP English 3. For our activity today, we're going to be re-looking at the sections The Wrath of Grendel and The Coming of Beowulf, only this time, instead of just being worried about key details that we were able to pick up on and put in the blanks on our paraphrase worksheets, we're going to look at some of the poetic devices and conventions that are present, and we're also going to be looking to see how this text connects to the culture as well as perhaps even other texts. As I noted in our instruction before and how I was going to approach this, on a first reading, we're just worried about basically like the 5W questions, the who, what, where, when, whys of the narrative. However, that alone isn't enough for this level of study that we're doing, especially in the college prep level at junior year. Therefore, it's always important to go back once those key details have been established and determine, okay, now that I know what's going on, let me go back and take a look at what other more sophisticated literary conventions or poetic conventions are present. And then I wonder how I can connect this to what I know about the Anglo-Saxon culture, the history of the people, and how this all relates to elements in that culture, as well as perhaps even at times outside texts. So you're going to be working with the PDF that I've attached to today's classroom assignment. Again, this is the entire Beowulf selection, but at this point, we've only read pages 40 through 48. So we've read the sections The Wrath of Grendel and The Coming of Beowulf. What I've created for us to practice with this is, again, I know that you hate these Google Slides with the text boxes, but they do make it very kind of simple to translate what we're working with. You're going to see that I created just two separate pages. I have 4 questions that correspond with the Wrath of Grendel on pages 40 to 44. And then I have another 4 questions that correspond with the Coming of Beowulf, which go from pages 44 to 48. These are not going to be questions about what happened. That should have been established when we had our paraphrases that paraphrase worksheet where I gave you some fill in the blanks. However, this time we're going to be talking about things like biblical allusion. Now, you defined biblical allusion the other day on Friday in an activity after your vocabulary quiz if you were in person. And then if you were at home that day, that was your focused activity. A biblical allusion is a reference to the Bible, the Christian Bible, Old Testament, Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament. Those largely shape much of what we see in some of the examples today. You'll be asked questions to refer back to some of those biblical allusions that you looked up on Friday's activity or on Thursday's activity if you were at home. So if you could take a look here at number 1, it says a biblical allusion appears in lines 1 through 15. It is the topic or theme of the songs that are sung by the shop or scop as he entertains Hrothgar and his men in Herin. What is it a reference to? Because again, allusions are references that the author assumes you are familiar with. So let me pull this up here. Let's take a look on page 40 and see if we can determine this. It says, a powerful monster living down in darkness growled in pain, impatient as day after day the music rang loud in that hall. You can see the little footnote here. The hall is here at the mead hall. The harp's rejoicing call and the poet's clear songs. That's the scop, the traveling poet. Sung of the ancient beginnings of us all, recalling the Almighty making the earth, shaping these beautiful plains marked off by oceans, then proudly setting the sun and moon to glow across the land and light it. The corners of the earth were made lovely with trees and leaves, and made quick with life, with each of the nations who now move on its face. One thing I keep making reference to, or hope to keep making reference to, is we really get an indication of the authorship of the text because of the honor or reverence that's given anytime the name of God is mentioned. And God, not as a single random God, but in this case, the author is trying to give honor to that single monotheistic God that the Christian faith believes in. Now, you'll see this is in contrast to the pagan beliefs that probably existed even for the people of Beowulf's time. And we saw reference to them making sacrifices to old stone gods at the end of the Wrath of Grendel section. However, this tale right here about the Almighty, when that's capital A, that's that Christian God, all right, like the big guy, capital G God. And again, that's not to say that that is the only way to view faith or gods or things like that. However, you are getting the author, whoever wrote this down, their beliefs about God through this. This is a story about the Almighty making earth. And if you can recall, if I go back here real quick, if I look up our biblical allusion activity that you should have already completed, you guys said it was a Google form. I had you look up the creation story. There was an embedded video in there, and I had asked you to play it and watch it and then summarize the creation story. If you did that, you will see that the connection between these opening lines is to that creation story, which if you weren't familiar with, I made sure you were acquainted with it. So you'll discuss that here. There is another biblical allusion that pops up that I make reference to in number 2. There's a biblical allusion to Grendel's ancestors in lines 29, starting in line 19 and going to 29. And again, this section here, okay, you're going to see that it refers to what you learned here in this activity from last week. So I'm connecting some things. I don't expect you to start from scratch with this stuff, especially with biblical allusions. While you may or may not have a background in which you would have been exposed to these things personally, because the influence of Christianity had such a profound effect on the culture and, of course, on this text, it's essential that we familiarize ourselves with them. The other questions I give relate to poetic conventions, so the use of kennings. If you can recall our kenning activity that we did last week, modern kennings, we did some translations. Hopefully that helped you become familiar with the concept if you didn't feel as confident before. If you can recall, I showed you some examples. You had an explanation of what they are at the top of this document. Again, this was from last week. And we practiced with some modern ones. Here you're going to see questions related to these kennings. Remember, kennings are poetic renamings of nouns. They offer the storyteller variety so they don't have to say the same names or refer to the same things over and over again by just the same word. But they also provide insight into the nature of the thing that's being renamed. So if you can recall this from last week, the sky candle as a kenning for the sun, battle sweat as a kenning for blood. Instead of referring to someone as the king, they might be called the giver of gold. And really cool kennings have striking imagery, sometimes contain alliteration like this one, or some other poetic conventions, consonants, striking imagery, rhyme, assonance. The ones that I highlighted today do not contain many of those poetic conventions, just as a note. And I put that here, that I don't see any examples in the first one I give you. Lastly, I ask for number 4, some examples of alliteration. Now, alliteration, if you recall, is the repetition of the sounds at the beginning of words. So the great example of that is Sally sells seashells at the seashore. And that's a tongue twister if you try to say it quickly. Now, we know alliteration was used by these shops or traveling poets as a means to offer kind of like sound stimulation. That sounds random, but as you sit and listen to this tale, there's no visuals to see. And it's fun to hear kind of like plays on words and things that play off of sounds, because that's going to be the heightened sense as warriors are listening to these tales be told. The text is rife with alliteration. I just ask you to find 2 examples, and I ask you to provide citations. And if you're unsure of what the citation for a text like this should look like, we're going to imitate largely what we did with the exile poem. However, in this case, we don't put the poetry and poem name in quotes because Beowulf is such a large work that's published as its own book. We actually treat it as if it was just a book title, so we can italicize. And then there's no comma after it, and we'll just put the line numbers with a dash in between. Okay. And when you quote, remember too that we can offer slashes between lines. If you remember doing that in your exile poem essay, that is a way to differentiate how when one line ends and another begins, and we imitate the capitalization. For the second part, the coming of Beowulf, I talk about how we learn some insight into the Anglo-Saxon culture. That's that third level. When I talked about level 1 is key details, level 2, we're going to look at poetic conventions and devices. Level 3, the deepest level, but requires the highest level thinking skills, is connecting it to the culture at large. I talk about the meaning, how we can kind of tell from the text that your lineage matters, your bloodline to the Anglo-Saxon people. There's an emphasis on the father in lots of cases, the paternal lineage, that's what that's called. And that's because this was largely a paternal society or a patriarchal society. Men were dominant in lots of ways. Kennings, in one case, will provide some emphasis about why lineage matters. I ask you to think back to how lineage affects Grendel's life in a way that's perhaps maybe even we can be sympathetic to. And I'm going to show you that there is a spin-off novel by someone named John Gardner who writes the story of Beowulf from Grendel's perspective. And again, it reminds me of the story of the three little pigs from the wolf's perspective. And I'll have a copy of that book that I show you. You know, from another perspective, traditional stories that we're familiar with can be quite different. There are several kennings used for King Hrothgar. I ask you to locate one and reveal what it reveals about the nature of King Hrothgar. I also bring in the element of how we see this mix of Christianity alongside of pagan belief systems. And the more important part of this question is how this relates to theories about the authorship of Beowulf. I'll attach that video again to this posting for reference. But remember, this was a story that had been told by word of mouth for who knows how long and was not recorded later until likely the church had established itself in the area. And with its literate monks and educated workers, they are the ones that wrote it down. But instead of writing down a story that that would not perpetuate the beliefs about God that they think should be in place, they add them in there, and it mixes kind of bizarrely with the old. Beowulf's closing lines when he's talking about his battle with Grendel involves a belief in fate, which is that your life path is just marked out for you and you cannot change it. You have to fulfill your destiny. That's a pagan belief system because it does not think that there is any free will or thing that an individual man can do to change it. That's considered pagan. And on the flip side of that, at the end, in the portion of his thing, he will say God's fate, God will decide the outcome of this battle. Well, that's making it seem like God will make a decision that it's not fated. So keep that in mind. And again, it's linked to the authorship is what's most significant. I again ask you to look for two examples of alliteration just to appreciate that element of this and the craft and style that had to occur, especially given the fact that this was translated from an old English, which, as I showed in class or shared videos of, is indecipherable to modern readers. It's obviously a dead language. But how much cleverness and creativity had to occur in order for translator to try to capture those sounds and those plays with sound. I'm looking forward to moving on to the battle with Grendel, beginning tomorrow, depending on your cohort. If you are going to be home tomorrow, what you're going to find is that you will do an activity that deals with the values of the Anglo-Saxon warriors that we see in the Coming of Beowulf section. If you're in person, we will read the next section. And then on Friday, that flip-flops. Okay? Please reach out to me with any questions. I hope you have a good day, and I hope that you enjoy kind of the layers of text that we see going on in Beowulf.